And now let's add selectors in the 3D scene which would allow us to switch between different materials. So if we go back up, now let's actually, before that, let's create the material that we're going to switch. And so we already have our first material here, shelf. Let's rename it shelf 0, and we're going to have shelf 1 and shelf 2, and we can actually delete those two now. And let's have 3 material nodes. This one is going to be using shelf 1, this one is going to be using shelf 2, and we're going to have a switch node. Now let's make those materials different. So let's not change the first one, and the second one is going to actually display a texture. So what we have in the documentation on Polygonjs, we have a resources section, and that resource section has a texture element. And the texture I'm going to show you, I picked it up from this website where I looked for wood, and I picked up that one. So we can simply add this texture into our project, and I'm actually going to add it to our public folder. And now from the editor, here is how we can load the texture. So we're going to create a cup network. I'm going to create cup, and in here we're going to create an image node, and from here we have this browse button, and then we can simply select the texture here, and you can middle click and make sure it's loaded correctly. So now we're going to assign that to a material. So if you select shelf 1 texture, we have the use map toggle, we display that, and now we can select the texture node. And now if we display the actual node, so we take the switch node and we select the first input, now we can see that we have our textures. And we're going to do the same thing for this second material. Selecting the map, adding the node, except that we are going to multiply that color from inside. We're going to go inside and we're going to create a parameter node, and we're going to call that base color, make it a vector 3 and as color, and we're going to plug that into the color. So now it's very black, but we have now this parameter which has appeared, and we're going to simply make it a little, still very dark but not completely black. So now when we move the switch parameter, then we switch between those 3 materials. So now how are we going to switch this number using spheres that are going to be on screen? So the first thing is, let's create those spheres. So I'm going to create another object, and I'm going to parent that under the camera, so it will always be in the same place in the screen. And let's call that material samples. So let's create a sphere, and let's transform that sphere. Here you go. And let's make it much smaller, and let's have it on different height. And I'm going to have the third one. It's going to be the opposite value, past, relative, like this. Let's make it those values even smaller. And so now if I move one, the other one is going to move accordingly. And I'm going to position that to the left of the screen, like this. Now as we can see that those spheres are actually creating shadows, and we don't want that. So we can use the object property nodes, and we're going to toggle the cast shadow and the receive shadow, where we're going to untoggle those properties. So now those spheres do not cast shadows anymore. And let's actually assign the materials to those spheres. So we're going to create material nodes, how are we going to detect that we are clicking on them? So what we're going to do now is we're going to create events nodes. So let's call that event. And the node we want to use is a raycast node. So that's going to detect what's under a specific vector through the camera. So what we need to, by default it doesn't do anything, we need to trigger it. So we're going to trigger it on when we move the mouse. So first we're going to create a pointer node, and we're going to select the pointer move. And we're going to plug the pointer move to the mouse position, so now we can see that this is going to change. So this is basically the position on the mouse on the screen from -1 to 1 1. And but that doesn't do anything yet. We need to also make sure this is triggered. And so what we should see here is a position changing when there is an object that is under the cursor. But we don't see anything yet. And that's because we need to look at the object mask. Here that does not resolve anything. So if we open the developer console and we clear it, if we print out what this resolves to, we don't have anything. And so we need to change this mask, and we're going to change it to material samples. So if we do that, now we have 6 objects. But that's too much. We only want 3 objects for those spheres. We have the groups which are the parents of the spheres. So we're actually going to go to object property again, and we're going to call them material samples raycast. That's going to be a name which is not going to resolve for any other object. We put it here, and now as we print we have only our 3 objects. So now if we look at the position is actually reacting only when we are on the spheres, but not when we are somewhere else. So one thing we can as well do is it would be nice to have the cursor reflect that. Right now the cursor does not change. So we can simply create a viewer node, and in the viewer node we can set and unset some CSS, which is going to be the active, which will change how the cursor looks like by default. So we're going to say when we hit an object, when the cursor is above something, then we set it to CSS. When we miss, then we unset it. So as I'm going above a sphere, the cursor looks like a hand. When I'm going away, it will look like a normal cursor. So that's a starting point. And now let's actually have, when we click on them, change the switch parameter. So we're going to duplicate this raycast, and we're going to have one which works when we move the mouse, so pointer move, and this one is going to be on a click. So we are going to be triggered differently. So this one is going to be on pointer down, and we need to activate pointer down here if we want this to be the event to actually be sent. And in here we want to use the attributes. Here we can detect an attribute on that geometry here, and by default it's the ID, and that will actually change this parameter, which we can use to change the switch node. So if we go back to the material samples, we can add an attribute create, and we're going to create an ID for each. The first one is going to be an ID of 0, second one is going to have an ID of 1, and last one is going to have an ID of 2. And now as we go back here, when we click, this value should change. It does not change yet, and the reason is as we have updated the node of this graph, whenever each node processes or changes, it creates a new object. So the objects that have been cached by this node have changed. And one way we can do that, so the objects that are detected are just different. Those ones do not have any ID. So we need to simply create a button here to trigger this update object event. And if I do that, dispatch, and now if I go back to my recast, then I should have the ID changing. So now we have, that goes from 1, 0, 1 or 2. So now we can do the same thing we did before, where we copy the parameter and we put that into the switch node, passed as relative. Now as I click on each of those nodes, the material changes. Now one thing that would be nice to have would be to, actually I should also have this button here on this hover node. One thing that would be nice to have, you have a circular disk around the sphere so that it confirms what I've selected. So let's go back in here and let's transform those spheres that we have. So we're going to transform them here, and in order to do that, it's going to be much easier to actually look from a side camera. So I'm going to create a second camera. I'm going to move around, and we can actually look at those spheres not from the main camera. So as I move around and I scale them slightly up, if I look at them from here and I scale them up, you can see that they're going to move away from the sphere that are here. And that's because of all the different transforms we have here, so we need to reorganize that. So the first thing we're going to do is going to move this transform down the chain, and we're going to merge everything back down into this one. And even when we do that, it still is not what we expect. So we need to change those transforms that are here into object mode. So we have transform can be applied on geometry or on the transform, and on the object level. So we're going to have it this one and this one at the object level. And now when we scale those spheres, this one should also be put at this level. So we're going to simply put that one here, this value here, while this one is 0, and we can actually bypass it. So now if we look at where our spheres are, now as I increase the sphere, I increase the sphere size as we would expect. So now let's add a material to those, and let's merge those together. And we have an error because we don't have any material here. So I go back to the material node, and I'm going to create a basic mesh builder, which is going to be a matte selection highlight. And let's make it for now green. So I'm going to create a parameter, base color, vector 3 as color, and I'm going to select green darkish, and I'm going to assign it here. Now they all look green, but what we can do is actually do not shade the front face but the back face, so it will look like we have that, and we do not see them because it's not scaled enough. So now we have what looks like a selection circle around it. So now how do we only have one of those? So we're going to use again the same the ID that we're detecting, but we're going to need to edit the parameter in order to do that. So we're going to say here is not that one. We're going to say here is our selection ID, selected ID, and we're going to compare with the attribute ID that we have here in the geometry. So a good idea is generally to round those values because they can always be not exactly 1, 0 or 2. So we run them and then we can compare them. So if they're equal, we're going to have a two-way switch. If the selected ID and the ID are the same, we're going to have 1, and then otherwise we have 0, and that goes into the alpha. So we make sure that we have the transparent node, and we also can remove the depth right. And now if we have 1, no, we should probably need to keep that. And we also need to increase the alpha test, just to be sure. So now as we change the selected, we have 1 or we have 2. So now we can again link that to the same geo attribute that we have here, param. And we passed it as relative. And if we go back to the first camera, now as we click on each of the sphere, the node is going to, the outline is going to follow. And let's see how it looks like from here. And that looks okay. Now, one thing we need to be aware of is that as we resize the window, we might have some issues with those spheres getting cropped at the limit. So one thing we should do is, if you go into the camera, and we can delete this second camera as well. If we go into this camera, we have the field of view adjust mode, and what we want to have is either cover or contain, depending on what you want to achieve. And here, contain is what we want. We want to make sure that those boxes, regardless of how the viewport is going to be resized, we want to make sure that those spheres are always going to be within the view. So right now we have 16 by 9 as a default, but we can probably have 1.4 as a good alternative.